Hi everyone! Today I will tell you the history of France. But first, let's clarify things. What I'm about to tell you is the history and prehistory of the territory where France is currently located. Because, wait for it, this territory has not always been called France. A lot of different peoples, tribes and cultures were living there before that. So please, subscribe, hit the bell and get comfortable, because in order to understand everything, I need to take you back to the origins of humanity in Eastern Africa 2.5 million years ago. Let's go! 2.5 million years ago, the Homo genus, aka humans, appeared in Eastern Africa. Several human species evolved, and about 500,000 years later, different groups of these men and women migrated towards Northern Africa, Asia, and then Europe. Each of them adapted to their environment and evolved into new species who migrated and evolved as well. That's how 100,000 years ago in Europe you could find the human species of Neanderthal, whose body was rather stocky and muscular, well adapted to the cold weather of the Ice Ages. And in the meantime in Africa there was another human species called Sapiens, who is basically us. Sapiens also started immigrating from Africa, spread in Eurasia and superseded other human species, such as Neanderthal, who partly mixed with Sapiens before disappearing about 35,000 years ago. Thanks to its cognitive abilities, Sapiens developed beliefs, myths and art, and approximately 10,000 years ago, the last ice age gave way to a warmer weather, and several peoples living in a particularly welcoming area of the Middle East progressively gave up their nomadic hunter-gatherer way of life, started cultivating and settled down in permanent places. Agriculture enabled them to produce more and thus to feed more people. This led to a demographic explosion and to the appearance of the first villages, and this new way of life spread across the West. Human societies became more and more complex, growing from tribes to civilization, such as the Sumerians, who were among the first people to write and then spread the use of the bronze out west. And in the West, more peoples developed, such as Etruscans, Iberians, Proto-Basques, also called Aquitanes, and Ligurians. And in 600 BC, Greeks from the rich city-state of Phocaea sailed across the Mediterranean Sea and founded on Ligurian territory the colony of Massalia, future Marseille, which established its own new colonies, such as Nice, Antibes, etc. But in the meantime, further north, some peoples managed to use iron, and thanks to it, they improved their tools and weapons, which enabled them to widen their territory. These peoples they are called the Celts. Some trade developed, but of course, the collision of all these peoples also led to conflicts. Firstly, among the many Celtic tribes, but also between the Ligurians and the Massaliots, and between other southern peoples, such as the Etruscans and the Republic of Rome, which, by the way, was looted by the Senon Celtic tribe in around 390 before Christ. But Rome got over it, conquered many territories, and became the biggest regional power after its victory against Carthage and Greece. But when its ally Massalia was threatened again by Ligurians and Salian Celts, Rome helped to push them back and took advantage of the situation to conquer, with the support of Idwi Celts, the south of what they called the Transalpine Gaul. But in 58 BC, the new governor of the Transalpine Gaul was Julius Caesar, and when his allies, the Idwi Celts, asked for his help to push back the Helvetii tribe out of their territory, he seized this opportunity to conquer the whole of Gaul, of course with the help of allied Celtic tribes. Tribes from the north and the Isle of Britain resisted, but all the other tribes were conquered within 6 years. The last Celtic alliance led by the Arverni Vercingetorix was defeated in Alesia, and Gaul became a Roman protectorate in 52 BC. After his victory, Caesar took the power in Rome, but was killed in 44 BC. And after a few years, his adoptive son Octavius took command and established the Roman Empire. He divided the territory conquered by Caesar into 3 provinces, Gallia Aquitania, Gallia Lugdunensis and Gallia Belgica, and Lugdunum, future Lyon, became the capital of the three Gauls, while Narbonne was already appointed capital of Gallia Narbonensis. Of course, there was some revolting done, but on the whole, the Celts, as well as the Ligurians, the Iberians, and the Aquitaine city dwellers, progressively melted into the Roman culture. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, and thermal baths were built, the elite adopted the Latin writing, and the Celtic gods were mixed with the Roman gods and the imperial cult. In a nutshell, they became Gallo-Romans. Meanwhile, in Judea, some man called Jesus started a new religious movement which stood out from Judaism and later took the name of Christianity. The promise of eternal life after death and less strict rituals than Judaism enabled the movement to spread into Greco-Roman cities and reach Gaul 200 years later. But since the Christians were rejecting the Greco-Roman gods and particularly the imperial cult, they were persecuted by the Romans. But the movement went on spreading to such an extent that in 313 after Christ, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and then converted to it. And around the end of the century, it became the empire's official religion. But as it gained more members, more clashes regarding this or that interpretation of the holy books arose. That's how the Arianism movement came to be. It's named after Arius, a theologian who considered, among other things, that Jesus was not born divine, but that he acquired his divinity after being resurrected. This movement spread so much that bishops had to gather in a council, the Council of Nicaea, and they ended up declaring Arianism heretic. But it did not prevent this movement from spreading among the Roman elite and among Germanic tribes. So, who are these Germanic tribes? You need to know that these tribes, coming from Scandinavian territories, had been alternating between collaboration and conflict with the Roman Empire for roughly a century. Some of these tribes had already been Romanized by integrating the Roman army in exchange for land. They were called the Roman Empire Federated Tribes, the Salian Franks, the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Goths, etc. And this is this Romanization which enabled Arianism to spread into some of these tribes, mixing into their close to Nordic mythology. But in 370 AD, the Huns arrived in Europe from Central Asia and pushed the Germanic peoples beyond the Roman Empire borders. First the Goths, and then in 406 some further western tribes, which then alternated between conquest and alliances with the Romans in exchange for land to settle. This led to the creation of federate Germanic kingdoms inside the Roman Empire, such as the Franks, the Visigoths, and the Burgundians kingdoms. But in the meantime, Roman soldiers had left Britannia and Armorica in order to fight these Germanic tribes, leaving the door open for the Picts, the Scots, the Angles, and the Saxons to push the Britons down to Armorica. This area became independent and gradually took the name of its new inhabitants, Britannia. And when the Huns, led by Attila, attacked Gaul in 451, all these tribes formed an alliance to push them back at the Battle of the Catalonian Fields. The alliance won, the Huns fled east, and the Germanic peoples settled on Roman territory for good. And while in the kingdom of Burgundy the relations between the Arian Burgundians and the Nicene Christians Gallo-Romans were good, the Visigothic kingdom imposed Arianism during the reign of King Eric in 462. But further north, King Clovis, Ludovic in German, unified the Frankish kingdom, conquered what was left of the Roman Empire, and converted to Nicene Christianity. In doing so, he became one of the only Nicene Christian leaders of the West and earned the support of the Eastern Roman Empire, as well as the Nicene Christian Gallo-Romans who were settled on Visigothic, Burgundians, and Alemanni territories. And this support enabled the Frankish kingdom to conquer its rival Germanic territories, marking the beginning of the Frankish Merovingian dynasty. But the Frankish kingdom struggled to maintain unity. Indeed, when a Merovingian king died, all his sons split up the territory, which led to the independence of Aquitaine and ended up dividing what was left in three territories: Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. each of them managed by what was called a mayor of the palace. These guys gained more and more power until 687, when Austrasia's mayor of the palace, Pepin of Herstal, defeated the king's troops. And also Pepin of Herstal let the king remain on the throne. He was the one in charge. His son Charles, later called Charles Martel, succeeded him in 720, but before talking about Charles Martel, let's see what was then happening in the Middle East. At the beginning of the 7th century, the prophet Muhammad managed to unify the different Arab peoples around Islam, and when he died in 632, Muslim Arab peoples started a holy war in order to spread Islam around the world. The new Umayyad dynasty spread to the west, taking the Moor Berbers on board with them, and arrived at the door of Frankish territories in 719, where they became known as Saracens. The Duke of Aquitaine drove them away in 721 in Toulouse, but lost Nîmes, Carcassonne and then some other territories. So he ended up asking help from Charles, who, after battling for 7 years, including near Poitiers and in Avignon, managed to drive them out. On the way, he brought Burgundy and Provence to heel, as some chiefs there had formed alliances with the Umayyads. Later on, the battles of Charles Martel would be magnified by the church in order to legitimize his lineage, because his son Pepin the Short was crowned king of the Franks by the Pope in 751, thereby starting the Carolingian dynasty. He also conquered Septimania and Aquitaine. His successor, Charles the Great, later called Charlemagne, conquered Lombardy and several Germanic territories that he Christianized by force, which earned him to be crowned emperor by the Pope in 800. King Louis the Pious succeeded him, but when he died in 842, his sons started a war with one another, which divided the empire in three: West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia, also called Germany. Three reasons led to the fall of the Carolingian Empire. Firstly, the war between the three kings left them weakened. Secondly, at the same moment, three foreign peoples invaded simultaneously the territory: the Vikings coming from the north, the Magyars from the east, and the Saracens from the south. And thirdly, the kings progressively saw their power being taken away by lords from the numerous principalities. This is called the feudal system. And autonomous duchies and counties started building castles made from wood at first and then from stone to defend themselves against invasions. In 911, the Carolingian dynasty lost East Francia for good, and in the same year the king of West Francia gave territories to the Viking chief Roland in exchange for his help to fight other Viking tribes. Side note, Roland's descendant later created the powerful Duchy of Normandy, Normandy meaning Northmen's land, that is Vikings, and one of them, William the Conqueror, became King of England in 1066. But let's go back to the 10th century. The king of West Francia's influence was now limited to a narrow stretch land, and his role was more symbolic than anything else. Bishops and great lords from the different duchies and earldoms were holding the power, and were electing kings, regardless of whether they descended from a Carolingian bloodline or not. And in 987, Hugues Capet from the Robertian family line was elected king. As far as the lord were concerned, he was a good fit because he came from a powerful family which had recently been weakened, making him more easy to control, and moreover, he had strong support from the church. And also, the Robertian family would only keep a narrow territory during the next 2 centuries. They would still manage to keep the royal title in their line. This was the beginning of the Capetian dynasty. During the Capetian period, divergences of interpretations in the Gospels kept arising, particularly regarding the Filioque, which in 1054 led to the division of Christianity between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But this did not stop the Christians to maintain the tradition of going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, with the permission of the Islamic Arabic Caliphate ruling the region. But in 1071 the Turkish Seljuk Empire invaded the Eastern Roman Empire, as well as the Holy Land, preventing Christians from going on pilgrimage to Christ's sepulchre. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Pope called the Western countries to the rescue in 1095, and ordinary people, like farmers, responded to the call and left for a holy war, killing Jews and plundering cities on their way. This was the First Crusade, but when they arrived on Seljuk territories, they got totally crushed because they simply were not soldiers. So it was now the turn of the great lord's armies to embark on this holy war, and after a great deal of plundering and a little bit of cannibalism, they managed to take over Jerusalem by taking advantage of the rivalry between the different Seljuk city-states. And while they were there, some lords decided to keep these territories for themselves, forgetting to give them back to their ally, the Eastern Roman Empire. These territories are called the Crusader States. The Order of the Knights Templar was then created in 1129 to protect the pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem. And the Knight Templars certainly had a lot of work, because over the two following centuries there would be no less than 7 crusades, each of them ending in a big failure. Crusaders often came back empty-handed and sometimes even attacked their Orthodox allies instead of the Muslims. In 1151, after the Second Crusade, Queen Aliénor of Aquitaine dumped her husband, the King Louis VII, and remarried with Henry Plantagenet, who was Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. Their combined territories made a big chunk of land, and when Plantagenet inherited the throne of England in 1154, all these territories became English. And the new king Philippe Auguste did not like being squeezed between England and the autonomous counties and duchies, so he decided to conquer these territories, extending the crown lands of Francia. For the first time in 300 years, the king became the largest landowner in the kingdom. But Philippe Auguste was not the only one wanting to extend his influence, so did the Pope. He had already a major influence in Western countries, but not in the county of Toulouse, which was very independent and where a minority of the elite belonged to several divergent Christian movements, wrongly amalgamated under the name of Cathars. In 1209, the Pope called for a new crusade to exterminate them, which ended up in 1229 with the creation of a tribunal specialized in the judgment of heretics, the Inquisition. Meanwhile, the new King Louis IX took advantage of this crusade to put the county of Toulouse under royal control, and all along the 13th century, the royal estate of Francia expanded its territory, centralized the power in Paris, and progressively spread the royal currency and the Francian language among the elite. But one duchy stayed under English rule. This is Guyenne, and in order to seal a peace treaty between the two countries, the King of France, Philippe the Fair, gave his daughter in marriage to the King of England, Edward II. These two had a son called Edward III, who later became King of England. Then Philip the Fair's third son, called Charles IV, became King of France, but when he died in 1328, he had no heir, except Edward III. However, giving him the power meant submitting France to England, and this was a big no-no for the French royal family. This is why the throne was handed to Charles IV's cousin, named Philip VI. In the beginning, Edward III accepted it, but when Philip VI took over Guyenne, he decided to claim the throne of France as payback, which set off the 100 Years' War in 1337. For almost 30 years, the French army got its ass kicked by the English, who had a great fleet and extremely efficient longbows. But the soldiers were not the only ones to die. In 1348, the Black Plague killed 1/3 of the European population. In 5 years, 25 million people died. Plus the deaths due to war-caused starvation and peasant revolts against nobles, plunderer soldiers and royal taxes, all of it created a climate of terror. There was a small respite during the reign of Charles V, but his heir and son Charles VI became mad and unfit to rule. Then two camps fought for the crown. The Duke of Orleans, brother of Charles VI, supported by the Armagnac family, and the Duke of Burgundy, cousin and advisor to Charles VI. After many battles, assassinations and acts of violence from both camps, giving England a way to invade the north of France, the Armagnacs allied with the heir to the throne, Charles VII, the son of Charles VI the Mad. In response, the Burgundians formed an alliance with the English and made Charles VI the Mad sign a treaty which disinherited his own son to the benefit of the King of England. The English attacked the Armagnac in the city of Orleans in 1428, while in the meantime a woman called Joan of Arc was claiming that God had directed her to free France and to put Charles VII on the throne. She convinced him to send her to Orleans, where she galvanized the soldiers, who finally managed to defeat the English. The way was now open toward the city of France, where Charles VII was crowned king, and in the meantime Joan of Arc rode toward Paris, but was captured on her way there by the Burgundians, who sent her to the English, and she was burnt alive in Rouen in 1431. For his part, Charles VII signed a peace agreement with the Burgundians, granting them independence. This put an end to the Civil War, allowed him to drive the English out of France in 1453, and take back Guyenne. This was the end of the 100 Years' War, which actually lasted 116 years. Then France expanded more and more by annexing the adjacent counties and duchies. In Brittany, Louis IX married Anne of Brittany in order to progressively integrate the duchy into France. Then Kings Charles VIII, Louis XII and Francis I started a war with Spain for the domination of Burgundy and the Italian states, leading to many battles including the Battle of Marignan. But after the unplanned discovery of the American continent in 1492 and the conquest of the Amerindian territories, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty collected a vast amount of wealth and power. And when the Habsburg Charles V acceded to the throne, he inherited a huge empire through former alliances and marriages in his family. To compete with him, Francis I allied with the powerful Ottoman Empire of the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who also wanted to expand in Europe, and he also sent Jacques Cartier colonize North America, hoping to find as much wealth there as his Spanish competitor did. But he didn't find gold, and winters there were very harsh, so France lost interest in this area until the increasing profitability of the fur trade with natives brought back interest in these lands from 1597, marking the resumption of the colonization of New France. In France, Francis I straightened the royal power against other lords and imported the principles of Italian Renaissance, a literary renaissance as the French language spread throughout the country, and an artistic renaissance as medieval castles underwent a wave of renovations in the Italian style first, and then in a style specific to France. But in the meantime, in the Holy Roman Empire of German nations, a priest known by the name Martin Luther was denouncing the quirks of the Catholic Church, and particularly the indulgence system, which consisted in reducing the time spent in purgatory after death in exchange of giving money to the church. Many German princes rallied this cause. They would later be called the Protestants. This movement divided into several branches and spread to France, where the Protestants were known as Huguenots, which led to the division of France between Huguenots and Catholics. And they slaughtered each other all along the 16th century. The most famous of these massacres is the Saint Barthélemy massacre in 1572. These massacres are called the French Wars of Religion, and they resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths in both sides. But in 1588, the legitimate heir of the throne, Henry of Navarre, future Henry IV of France, was himself a Huguenot. And in order to secure the support of the Catholic community, he ended up converting to Catholicism, which led him to the throne and put an end to the French Wars of Religion. But he still promulgated the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted freedom of religion and equal rights to the Huguenots. In 1610, Henry IV of France was assassinated, and when his successor Louis XIII was old enough to reign, he placed his trust in one advisor alone, the Prime Minister Cardinal Richelieu, who very much wanted to strengthen the royal authority. He forbade Huguenot strongholds, which threatened to become a counterpower in France. He strongly raised the taxes to finance the war against the Habsburgs, leading to uprisings within the population. And he reduced the nobles' privileges, which made him lose their support. This policy went on under the regency of Anne of Austria and her prime minister Mazarin, which led the noble parliamentarians and princes to rise up and attempt a coup to take over the throne. These events are called the Fronde. But Mazarin violently repressed the coup, formed an alliance with England, and won the war against Spain in 1659. At that moment, Louis XIV was old enough to assume power. He decided to reign without a prime minister and to develop absolute monarchy at its highest level. First, he claimed to be the representative of God on earth. He was now in charge of electing bishops, and he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which led to a massive exodus of the Protestant population. Secondly, he made the aristocracy and provincial governors live in court in his new Versailles palace in order to better control them. And finally, he unified the army under his command, as it was previously controlled by several nobles, and he enlarged it a lot. This enabled him to fight all along his reign against other European powers for the domination of Europe, but also of the world. Because scientific progress and the rise of the stock market enabled private business companies from England, the United Provinces and France to settle in many different countries in order to trade and, if possible, to conquer them. During the 17th century, France set up trade posts in the Indian Ocean and in Africa and conquered the West Indies, fighting what was left of the local Carib peoples, and then implemented under Louis XIV the triangular trade. In a nutshell, they shipped European products to Africa and traded them for slaves with the Africans. These slaves were sent as a workforce in the West Indies plantations, where they were traded for colonial production, which was then shipped back to Europe and sold there. These first colonies gave a worldwide dimension to European conflicts, which now involved their colonies in war negotiations. First, New France. Louis XIV had to partly give away this territory to England after the Spanish Succession War, and then Louis XV had to give them the rest of it after the 7 Years' War, along with control over the east of India, which established England as the world's greatest power. And finally, from 1775, the United States of America, that France helped during their independence war against England, which increased the French debt a lot. In the meantime, a new philosophical and intellectual movement appeared in England and in the United Provinces, and spread through France during the reign of Louis XV, the Enlightenment. This was a revolution in the way people thought, carried by Marivaux, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot or Montesquieu. For the first time, an intellectual power rose outside monarchist and religious institutions. People talked about human rights, challenged the authority of the church, and questioned absolutism. The Enlightenment pushed the nobility and bourgeoisie to demand more involvement in power, as in parallel, tensions grew within the rest of the population because of bad harvest. As for Louis XVI, he is more worried about the big debt that France had racked up, and his plan to reduce it was to tax for the first time the nobles, which of course made them turn on him. In 1789, in order to solve this crisis, Louis XVI called for a large consultation with deputies of the clergy, the nobility and the Third Estate, composed of the bourgeoisie and the common people. This assembly was called the Estates General. But the Third Estate felt underrepresented in this Estates General, as it carried the voices of 96% of the population. So they seized their chance. On June 20, 1789, they gathered in the Salle du Jeu de Paume to write the Constitution, and they created the National Assembly. The legislative was now distinct from the executive. On July 14th, the Bastille prison was taken by the people. This was the French Revolution. Revolutionaries put an end to noble privileges, proclaimed all men are born free and equal in rights, implemented a constitutional monarchy in 1791 and abolished slavery in 1794 after the Santo Domingo Rebellion. But meanwhile, their policy became more and more intolerant against opponents to the revolution, who were jailed or deported, and against the Catholic clergy, which led to strong tensions all around France. Nobles fled to other kingdoms and asked them to intervene. Thus, two camps appeared among the revolutionaries. The moderates, represented by Lafayette and Barnave, who wanted to put an end to the revolution and straighten the French constitutional monarchy by declaring war to foreign monarchies. And the radicals, represented by Danton and Robespierre, who wanted to go on with the revolution until the Republic was proclaimed and keep eliminating counter-revolutionaries inside the country. Both camps ended up agreeing to go to war against Austria and Prussia and then proclaimed the Republic on September 21st, 1792. They guillotined Louis XVI in 1793, which created a coalition of foreign monarchies against France. Thus, 300,000 additional French people had to go to war. This was the last straw for many French regions that had already been violently affected by the anti-religious measures, so they rose against the revolutionary government. And in the northwest, the rebellion evolved into an ultra-violent civil war in Vendée, which killed around 150,000 people. Meanwhile, Robespierre, supported by the Parisian sans-culotte revolutionaries, ordered the arrest of moderate members of parliament, took over power and put under guillotine everyone suspected to be a counter-revolutionary, meaning 100,000 people, including Danton, his former ally. Everyone was a suspect. It was terror everywhere in France. Robespierre was overthrown in 1794 and centrist revolutionaries called the Thermidorian Republicans took power and put an end to the terror. In order to rule, they created an executive council known as the Directory, composed of 5 people. In the meantime, the Revolutionary Army was winning a lot of battles and established some republics in the conquered territories. And a general known as Bonaparte stood out in Italy and grew in popularity. He took advantage of the Directory's political instability to come back to France, instigated a coup in 1799 and became consul for life. Napoleon straightened the country, created the Bank of France and the Civil Code, brought back the estate and the Catholic Church together, and restored slavery in the colonies. Then, in 1804, England demanded that France release Holland and Switzerland, and Napoleon used this threat of a new war to make the French people plebiscite him as emperor. England put an embargo on French ships, but the English fleet was too powerful for Napoleon to fight directly. So he decided to economically suffocate England, and to do so, he had to dominate the whole of Europe. Within 8 years, he managed to conquer a great part of Europe all the way to the gates of Russia, defeating every coalition in their attempts to stop him. But when the Napoleonian army arrived in Moscow, the Muscovites fled their city and burnt it. With no shelter nor food, the Napoleon troops froze to death. After that disaster, Napoleon was defeated many times, and finally France was invaded by the coalition. Napoleon was exiled, but came back in 1815. He managed to assume power again for 100 days, but was badly defeated in Waterloo by the English. Then he was exiled again for good this time on the island of Saint Helena. The coalition set up a new constitutional monarchy in France with Louis XVIII, who was Louis XVI's brother. This was the Bourbon Restoration. Then his ultra-royalist brother Charles X succeeded after him. He censored the printing press, favored the rich, and gave political power to the church, which led to 3 days of new revolution in July 1830. This revolution put Louis Philippe on the throne, who repeated the same kind of mistakes and was overthrown by a third revolution in 1848. This time, the Republicans managed to proclaim the Second Republic, and while everybody was waiting for the first presidential election, the provisional government implemented the freedom of the press, the abolition of slavery, the restriction of working time to 10 hours a day, and finally, the universal manhood suffrage, which enabled the election of the first president of the Republic for a 4-year term, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, none other than the nephew of Napoleon I, who was supported by common people. But 3 years later, after a coup accepted in a plebiscite by citizens, he proclaimed himself emperor as Napoleon III. He implemented an authoritarian policy which repressed uprisings, restrained freedoms, and as such created a stable political and economic context which enabled the relaunch of colonization, already started by Louis XVIII and Charles X, particularly with the violent conquest of Algiers in 1830, and which was intensified during the Empire with an expedition in Mexico and the conquest of territories in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and in the Pacific Ocean. And secondly, this stability enables an ambitious program to rebuild Paris entirely, along with the Baron Haussmann, and to reduce the industrial gap with England by building the railway system, funded by new investment banks. With this industrialization, two new social classes appeared, the business and industrial bourgeoisie and the working class beset by misery, for whom Napoleon III unpenalized strikes in 1864. This political regime was deeply established in the countryside, but was questioned by the middle class, and a new revolution was about to unfold. To avoid it, Napoleon III accepted to give more power to the parliament, and in 1870, in order to restore his dominant power in Europe, he took advantage of the time's patriotic mood to declare war to Prussia and its North German Confederation. This way, he was looking to assert his power in a war he believed easy to win. But before long, France was suffering a lot of defeats. Napoleon III was taken prisoner, and the Prussian and German coalition was headed to Paris. On the one side, the Parisian working class and the far left wing wanted to take advantage of Napoleon III being imprisoned to proclaim the Republic and to fight this war to push back the coalition. But on the other side, the Republican deputies were hesitant. Yes, they wanted the Republic, but through official elections in order to assert their legitimacy in the entire country and not only in Paris. And if they wanted elections, they needed peace. But under the popular pressure, the Republican deputies proclaimed the Republic and the state of war on September 1st, 1870. Thus, the Prussian and German coalition besieged Paris. The civil Parisians and the National Guard defended the city, while some Republican deputies such as Jules Favre or Adolphe Thiers tried to negotiate peace in secret. And the peace agreement was finally signed with the coalition on January 28, 1871, followed by the election of a Royalist National Assembly and by a national vote from which Adolphe Thiers was elected Chief of the Republic. But the Parisians did not agree with this, and when Thiers tried to seize their cannons, the Parisians and the National Guard rose up and created the revolutionary government of the Paris Commune, a movement which spread to Lyon, Marseille and Toulouse. The Parisian communards fought a war against the French Republic government, which took refuge in Versailles, and a very large number of them were executed on Thiers' order. This massacre put an end to the Paris Commune and left a deep scar on the French working movement. Meanwhile, Prussia imposed very hard conditions for peace. France had to pay a compensation of 5 billion French francs and lost the regions of Alsace and Moselle. Following this defeat, the founders of the Third Republic's values became deeply rooted in a strong patriotism and in an intense belief in the Republic and in progress, and they spread these values through their reforms. The Marseillaise as a national anthem, Marianne, Bastille Day as a national bank holiday, development of freedom and education became free, secular and mandatory. But not all of it was good. As for history, school children were taught a unified version of the history of France, presenting the Gauls as the French common ancestors, excluding France's regional history to the benefit of the history of the royal domain, and presenting the Republic as the ultimate achievement of progress. And finally, the Third Republic went on with colonization, presented as a duty to bring civilization as well as Christianism to colonized countries. And in 1881, the Third Republic implemented the Native Code, which declared colonized people as subjects of France and denied them citizenship. England, France and other European countries shared Africa among one another, designing artificial borders which divided African peoples, while in Asia, France went on with the conquest of Indochina. In France, the Second Industrial Revolution brought progress to the automobile and electricity sectors, and now that the Republic was stable, new socialist movements appeared, and some of them asked for a fairer tax which would adapt to the people's income. And while the left wing and the right wing split deeper and deeper, the Dreyfus case, started in 1894, intensified this gap in an anti-Jewish hatred background. And we arrive in the year 1914. You need to know that since the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, European countries had been forming alliances with other countries in order to get stronger. And when the Serbian man from Bosnia killed the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, all these alliances activated, which led to World War I. But why was this war worldwide? First, because colonized countries were massively requisitioned to send troops to Europe. And moreover, all along this war, new countries integrated one alliance or the other. In France, the war against Germany quickly became a trench warfare which killed more than 1.7 million people, and when everything ended in 1918, the war and Bolshevik Revolution in Russia caused the fall of four empires and reshaped the European map. Regarding France, the country recovered Alsace and Lorraine and made Germany pay a steep price in war compensations. And following the financial crisis of 1929, a dangerous rise of nationalism in Germany, Italy and France pushed the three French left-wing parties to merge forces and create the Popular Front, which won in 1936 the elections and gave a lot of new rights to the working class. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler won the election in 1932 and implemented a totalitarian regime based on a cult based on his personality, the project to create a new man and a strong nation with the Aryan model, an expansionist policy, and of course, scapegoats, the Jews and other minorities. Germany invaded Austria in 1938, then Czechoslovakia in 1939, but France and England were not ready for war, so they did not react. But when Poland was invaded in 1939, they ended up declaring war to Germany. This is World War II. France secured the Maginot Line, but on May 10, 1940, the Germans swiftly attacked France and had it surrender. They divided France into two areas, a zone under German control and an unoccupied zone where French political leader Marshal Pétain settled down in Vichy, from where he collaborated with Germany, causing, among other things, the deportation of 76,000 Jews. In the meantime, French General Charles de Gaulle fled to England, from where he organized the French resistance, both in the country with Jean Moulin and outside of France by progressively rallying French colonies with the help of England. In 1944, a big part of Eastern Europe was freed by the USSR, which then occupied this country according to the Yalta Agreement. And in France, the Normandy and the Provence landings led to the liberation of the entire country on May 8, 1945. As for Japan, the country was still at war, but they surrendered after the USA launched 2 nuclear bombs on the country. The war toll? It was 18 million militaries dead and 45 million civilians dead, partly caused by the extermination camps. But the end of the war did not put an end to the massacres. First in France, where the liberation triggered an anti-collaboration wave, causing the execution of 9,000 people. But also for the Algerians, for whom the armistice on May 8th was the opportunity to demonstrate against colonization and for their independence in return of their strong involvement in the liberation of France. But France violently repressed these demonstrations, killing thousands, maybe even tens of thousands. This event was a sign that a big wave of decolonization was coming. How come? Firstly, because in 1941, after the German invasions, Roosevelt and Churchill promulgated the Atlantic Charter, stating that every country has the right to choose the type of government they want to live in. Add to this a weakened Europe, the creation of the United Nations Organization, which supported decolonization, and the Cold War between the USA and the USSR, which both supported different colonized countries, and boom, colonized countries started rebelling. In 1946, communist Viet Minhs fought for their independence and won the war against France in 1954. The same year, uprisings in Algeria were brutally repressed by France. The country gained its independence in 1962, and many Algerians who had been enrolled in the French army, the Harkis, were compelled to avoid being killed to take refuge in France, which neglected them. The Algerian War even caused the fall of the French Fourth Republic, but it opened the door to negotiations with all the other colonized countries. Some of them chose to remain French, and others progressively got their independence. Although France still maintains a strong monetary, financial and economical control in these countries. But let's go back to post-war France. In 1944, women obtained for the first time the right to vote. The National Committee for Resistance nationalized the energy, insurance and financial sectors and created the French social security system. French people made a lot of babies, and in the Cold War context, France signed a military treaty with the USA, integrating the NATO and receiving in exchange, like many other European countries, financial assistance from the US. The Marshall Plan, which boosted its economic growth. Charles de Gaulle returned to power in 1958, set up the Fifth Republic, took his distance with the USA, and resigned from presidency after the referendum following the student demonstrations of May 1968. European countries gathered into a European Economic Community, which became the European Union in 1992. Then trade between countries increased, leading to globalization, which spread to other sectors such as culture, science or information thanks to the internet. And the impact of globalization and the increase of worldwide consumption caused numerous drifts, which started to throw the Earth's ecosystem off balance. What solutions will humanity find concerning this worldwide ecological issue? History will tell. And that's it for the history of France. I hope you liked it. If yes, please subscribe and like this video. You can also share it with your friends who want to go to France, or with your French teacher, well, with anybody who would be interested in it. I also made this video in French on my French channel Histoire du Monde, so watching it could be an interesting way for you to learn French. And if you have any thought about this video, please, the commentary box is here for you. Of course, each second of this video has already been detailed in a whole book, so if you are a noob in French history, I can only advise you to make some more research and to read some more books in order to nuance what I said and to get into more details. And if you want to support me in this huge enterprise of summing up the history of all the countries in the world, there are many ways to do so. You can click on the join button when I will have enough subscribers to activate it, or you can donate on Tipeee or Utip, the links are below. I wish you all the best and see you soon. Tschüss!